It's funny. We use these terms science and democracy all the time. Like they're these big, important ideas. But I wonder, do we ever really think about how connected they are?
It's really interesting, right?
Yeah. Like, what if I said that how well one of them is doing is really tied to how healthy the other one is?
That's basically the whole point this book we're looking at today is trying to make. Anti-science and the assault on democracy. The idea is that more and more people not believing in science. It's not just about disagreeing on some facts. It really could be dangerous for how our entire society works.
So it's more than just someone saying, I don't believe in climate change, that kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. It's not just, oh, I don't agree with that specific research. It's more like they just don't trust any experts at all.
Right.
It's like they're saying, my gut feeling, way more important than your years and years of research and all the evidence you've got.
Huh. And this book saying that directly makes democracy worse. I'm really curious to see how they put those two things together.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But before we go too far, let's make sure we're on the same page about what science actually means. Because it's not just labs and equations and all that, right?
Yep.
It's really a way of thinking that we all use every day, maybe without even realizing it.
So it's not just for scientists in those white coats. Like it's not some special club or something.
Not at all. It's about thinking logically, really observing things, and always testing your assumptions. Almost like fine-tuning a recipe, you could say.
Okay.
You know how it is? If a recipe keeps messing up, you wouldn't just keep making it the same way, would you? You'd change it up, try to figure out where you went wrong. That's that scientific spirit right there.
I see what you mean. So it's less about just memorizing facts and more about how you see the world and how you figure things out.
Exactly. And that's where this connection to democracy starts to become clear. They both depend on this shared goal of finding the truth, without letting our own opinions get in the way.
Kind of like when you're trying to settle an argument with a friend. If you both come in totally set in your ways, you're never really going to listen to each other.
That is a perfect example. And this book, it argues that if we lose sight of that importance of logic and evidence, we get more likely to just accept anything anyone tells us as long as it's said with enough authority. And that's when democracy gets shaky, you see.
It's good to be able to disagree, but we should all be playing by the same rules,
Right.
using facts and logic.
That's it, exactly. And this book,
Yeah.
it's full of examples of how this anti-science way of thinking is popping up everywhere in modern life. It's kind of scary, actually.
Oh, I bet. Give me an example. What's something that really stood out to you?
Well, think about people who deny climate change is real. A lot of times, it's not even that they truly disagree with a mountain of scientific proof. It's that they just don't trust scientists, maybe their motives or the schools they came from.
So it's like they think there's this big conspiracy going on instead of actually looking at the data.
Yep, you
Yeah.
got it. And that right there, that's how this anti-science stuff takes root. It feeds on feelings, on our biases, and it offers these easy answers to problems that are actually super complicated. And let's be real, those simple answers, they're tempting.
They are tempting, yeah. Okay, so we've talked about not trusting experts, but what about the opposite? Should we just blindly trust experts all the time?
That's a really good point. And it brings us to this thing called scientism. It's when we try to make complicated things sound simple. We ignore all the nuance and just latch onto easy explanations. Kind of like with genes, this idea that our genes control everything about us.
Oh, right. Like that saying, it's in my genes. Like you can't help it.
Exactly. And people love to hear about some gene that explains everything about us, right? Intelligence, political views, whatever. But it's usually not that simple. And that desire for those easy answers, it can be dangerous. The book uses this example, the Hamlet evaluation system they used in the Vietnam War.
You know what? I'm going to have to stop you there for a second. I think I need a little more background on that one. What was this Hamlet system, and how does it relate to simplifying things too much?
You're right to flag that. It's not exactly a household term. So the Hamlet evaluation system was this attempt to measure how well things were going in the Vietnam War. They used these metrics to see how secure villages were, counting things like enemy casualties or how much the infrastructure got improved.
Yeah.
It all sounds very scientific, very data-driven on the surface.
Right. I can see how that would be appealing. Who doesn't like a good chart or graph, right? It makes you feel like, okay, we're making progress. The numbers are going up.
Exactly. But the problem was that reality on the ground was much more complicated than what these metrics could capture. It's like over-relying on these numbers actually hid a much deeper misunderstanding of the local culture, the people's motivations, the war itself. It's like a cautionary tale about mistaking data for wisdom.
Wow, that's a chilling example. So we've got to be careful, like not to get blinded by the appeal of a simple answer, even when it's wrapped up in data and presented with scientific authority.
Precisely. And that brings us back to what you were saying earlier about the danger of blindly trusting experts. It's not about rejecting them outright, but about cultivating that critical thinking muscle. We need to be able to ask the right questions, to see the difference between correlation and causation, to understand that, like, even the most rigorous scientific research is always a work in progress. It's not the final answer.
So how do we find that balance then? How do we engage with science, benefit from expert knowledge, but also stay vigilant against those oversimplifications, those tempting genes for everything explanations?
Well, I think a big part of it is understanding how science really works. It's not about memorizing a static set of facts.
Hmm.
It's about that ongoing process of inquiry, of constantly refining our understanding as new evidence comes out.
So it's less about knowing all the answers and more about knowing how to ask the right questions.
Exactly. And that's a skill that's transferable to all areas of life, not just science. Whether we're evaluating political arguments, making decisions about our health, or even just trying to navigate our social media feeds, that ability to think critically, to evaluate evidence, to be open to changing our minds when presented with new information, that's essential for being an informed and engaged citizen in the 21st century.
It makes you realize how important it is to be aware of our own biases, right? Like
Yeah.
that whole confirmation bias thing we talked about earlier, we need to be willing to seek out diverse perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable, even if they challenge our deeply held beliefs.
Absolutely. Because if we're only ever exposed to information that confirms what we already believe, our worldview becomes very fragile, very susceptible to manipulation. And that's precisely the kind of environment where this anti-science sentiment can flourish.
So it's not just about science literacy, it's about media literacy, critical thinking skills. All of these things are intertwined, aren't they?
You got it. And this is where I think education plays such a crucial role, not just in terms of teaching scientific facts, but in equipping people with the tools to navigate this complex information landscape, to separate fact from fiction, to think for themselves.
Which is more important than ever in this age of information overload, right? Where we're bombarded with conflicting narratives from every direction.
Exactly. And this connects to another fascinating thread in the book, the idea of accelerationism. Have you encountered that term before?
I've definitely heard it thrown around, usually in hushed, slightly terrified tones, but I'll admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details. It's one of those things that makes me want to hide under the covers and hope it just goes away.
I hear you. It can seem like a pretty dense topic,
Yeah.
but at its core, accelerationism is about the relationship between technology and society.
Mhm.
Essentially, it's the idea that we should accelerate technological advancement, regardless of its potential consequences, either because it will lead us to a utopian future or because the consequences are inevitable anyway.
So it's either techno-utopia or we're just along for the ride into the singularity. It's either Elon Musk colonizing Mars or robots taking over the world. There's no middle ground.
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but you've hit on a key point. Accelerationism tend to be pretty polarizing. Some people see it as this exhilarating embrace of the unknown, a way to break free from the constraints of our current systems. Others see it as reckless and dangerous, a recipe for disaster.
And where does this fit into our discussion about science and democracy? How does it relate to this whole anti-science trend?
That's where it gets really interesting because accelerationism often rejects the idea that we can or should control the pace of technological change. It challenges those traditional notions of expertise. It questions whether those in power, whether it's governments or scientists, should have the authority to dictate the direction of technological progress.
It's almost like a techno-libertarianism, a belief that technology should be free from any kind of regulation or oversight.
In a way, yes. And while that might sound appealing to some, it also raises some important questions about accountability, about ethics, about the potential consequences of unchecked technological advancement.
Especially when you consider how technology, particularly things like artificial intelligence, are already shaping our lives in profound ways, from the news we consume to the choices we make.
And that's precisely why this conversation about science, democracy, and the role of expertise is so crucial. Because as technology continues to advance at an exponential rate, we need to be equipped with the critical thinking skills and the shared values to navigate its impact on our lives and to ensure that it's used for good, not for harm.
So it's not about rejecting technology outright, but about approaching it with a critical eye, with a sense of responsibility, and with a commitment to democratic values.
Exactly. And that requires engaging in these complex conversations, grappling with these difficult questions, and fostering a culture that values reason, evidence, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Thinking back to the Hamlet evaluation system example, it makes you wonder, are there other ways that we're oversimplifying complex issues today, especially with the rise of big data and algorithms?
That's such a crucial question. And it leads us to another area where this tension between science and anti-science plays out. The ongoing debate about genetic determinism.
This whole genetic determinism thing, it's like, are we really just robots, just running off our DNA? Or is there more to it than that?
Is a very appealing idea, right? To think our genes are like a blueprint for who we are. But like most things, it's not that straightforward.
So there's not really a single gene for intelligence or for being good at sports. That's not how it works.
Right. Genes definitely have their part to play, but they're not the whole story. The environment we grew up in, the things we learn, the decisions we make, those all mix with our genes in really complex ways. It's not nature versus nurture. It's both working together, always.
So it's like a two-way street. Genes and experience are always talking to each other.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where this anti-science thinking can trip us up. Because if we get stuck on the idea that genes are destiny, it's like saying we have no control over our own lives, no power to learn, grow, make better choices.
Yeah, it's like we're letting ourselves off the hook. Like, oh, it's my genes. What can I do?
Exactly. And that kind of thinking, it can have real consequences in the world. It can lead to discrimination, making people think some folks are just inherently better than others because of their genes.
Like trying to use science to justify being prejudiced.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to challenge those overly simple explanations, to emphasize how complicated these issues really are, and to remember, real science is about embracing the nuances, not pretending they don't exist.
It's like a lot of times we're looking for science to give us a clear yes or no answer, but really it's more like learning to live in the gray areas.
You got it. Science is a process, not a finish line. It's about always questioning, always being open to new findings, and getting a clear picture of the world bit by bit.
So how do we balance that? How do we accept that science is always changing while still trying to find solid answers to complicated questions?
That's where having that scientific mindset becomes so important. It's about accepting that we don't know everything, being okay with uncertainty, and realizing we might never have all the answers.
So it's almost like learning to be okay with the mystery of it all.
That's actually a beautiful way to put it. Because when we let go of needing to be absolutely certain all the time, it opens us up to new ideas, to seeing things from different angles, to really appreciating how amazing and complex the world is.
It strikes me that a lot of what we've been talking about comes down to trust. Trusting experts, trusting the institutions where knowledge is created, trusting the process of science itself.
That is such a key point. Because at its heart, science depends on a foundation of trust. Trust that the research is done right. Trust that scientists will call each other out if something's wrong.
But it's tough these days, There's so much out there telling us to doubt everything, misinformation, conspiracy theories. It's like a free-for-all.
You're right. And that makes it more important than ever to be really careful about the information we consume. To be able to spot the difference between a source that's credible and one that's just trying to push an agenda.
Which takes us back to those critical thinking skills, right? Being able to weigh the evidence, spot bad logic, and ultimately think for ourselves.
Exactly. And those skills are essential for everything, not just science. They help us make sense of the world, especially as it gets more and more complex.
So for our listeners who are trying to find their way through all of this, what can they do? What would you say is the most important takeaway when it comes to this anti-science way of thinking that's becoming so common?
If there's one thing I want everyone to take away from this, it's this. Never be afraid to ask questions. Question everything. Question what you see online. Question what politicians tell you. Even question what you learned in school.
So it's about nurturing that healthy skepticism.
Exactly. And go along with that skepticism with a big dose of curiosity. Seek out different points of view, even if they make you a little uncomfortable. Read widely. Listen to different perspectives. Have those good, challenging conversations with people who see things differently than you do.
Because the more we open ourselves up to different ideas, the better we become at figuring out what's true, right? And forming our own opinions.
Exactly. And lastly, Don't underestimate how powerful your own voice is. Share what you learn, have those respectful dialogues, and support policies that encourage science literacy and critical thinking.
So it's about taking charge, really being part of creating a future where science and democracy can both be strong.
Absolutely. In the end, the future of both of those things depends on having people who are informed and engaged in the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been an amazing deep dive. I know I've learned a ton, and I hope everyone listening has too.
It's been a real pleasure. These are complicated topics, no doubt about it. But the more we talk about them, wrestle with the ideas, the better prepared we'll be for whatever challenges and opportunities come our way.
I completely agree. And to everyone listening, remember, there's always more to learn. So keep asking those tough questions, keep seeking out knowledge, and keep diving deep.